Okay, so given all the health-related issues that we're having in the country right now and globally, what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about health in cities because there's a lot of things that cities in particular can do, and we're starting to see the impact of more progressive and thinking mayors in related to the virus and how they're implementing various measures to try to reduce the infection rates. So if you haven't seen or heard of Majora Carter, her TED Talk here is actually quite interesting. And the TED Talks are 18 minutes. And the reason why TED Talks are 18 minutes, if you don't know, is they figure that anyone who wants to give a talk, if you tell them 15 minutes, people tend to accept that as, yeah, it's approximately 15 minutes. Or if you tell them 20 minutes, they'll go, yeah, it's approximately 20 minutes. But they found that if you tell people that it's exactly 18 minutes, people tend to stick to exactly 18 minutes. It's a interesting phenomenon on how people think about numbers and precision of numbers. For some reason, 18 means 18, 15 means 24, give or take. So last time we saw this picture, which left us a little bit on the depressed side on the damage that we had done to the environment. Right, this is the Cuyahoga River outside of Cleveland, right, that we saw that it caught on fire and it burned for quite a while before they could put it out because of all the pollutants that were in the water. And this act led to the Clean Water Act. And in fact, we had a whole series of acts that led to the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, right, which helped rapidly improve the environmental conditions, particularly in cities. Because as we know, cities tend to be warmer, so they tend to have more pollution associated with that because the chemical reactions happen faster. So what I wanted to do is focus a little bit here, as I think the Chicago heat wave of 1995 can give us some insight into how we can begin to handle some of the situations now. Because one of the things that we know about our virus is that it does tend to impact people who are already at risk, elderly folks, respiratory impaired individuals, or immunocompromised individuals. And so oftentimes you need people to go check on them to make sure that they are okay. And so the Chicago heat wave have very similar finding in many ways around that need for people to pay attention to other people and check on them. So this was in summer of 95, and for a week the temperature in Chicago reached over 100 degrees. And so Chicago, hot, big city. And so this is just the temperature, not including the humidity. It was not unusual for the humidity plus the temperature to reach a heat index of 120, 125 degrees, which is very, very hot. At about 146 degrees combination temperature and humidity, the human body tends to stop functioning because we can't sweat, and the sweat doesn't evaporate away from our skin, so that means we overheat. And so what was going on is that there were a lot of areas of the city that couldn't afford air conditioning. And so a number of folks ended up dying due to this heat wave. And they began to look at it and they go, how can we manage this? Because one of the first line workers basically just said, look, this is the equivalent of a fatal jetliner, carrying about 600 people every day, and it crashed that way for 3 consecutive days. Okay? So how can we do this and use this disaster to help us today? Well, in his book, let me zoom back here, Eric Kleinenberg's book, it's an excellent book. So it's a social autopsy, disaster of Chicago. Why he uses that social term is what he did is he did an interesting map, and he began to look at capital. And as opposed to defining capital as other forms, as a monetary capital or resource capital, it was all basically built around social capital. Okay? And one of the things that they found in their analysis that some areas of the city did much better than other areas of the city, and it didn't matter on income levels, it didn't matter on demographics. And so there were some Hispanic neighborhoods that really suffered. There were some Hispanic neighborhoods, given all the other variables the same, did well. Same thing with African American neighborhoods. Okay? But not all of them were equal. One of the things that they found that was critically important was access to green space, because what that enabled was somebody to go, I haven't seen Mrs. Smith or Mrs. Jones today. Maybe we should go check on her. Because people got to know their neighbors because they would hang out in parks and they would get to just see them. And if they didn't see them, and maybe they thought something was wrong and somebody would check on them. So neighborhoods that had green space within a quarter mile of low-income housing, those neighborhoods had much fewer fatalities than those neighborhoods who did not have green space, because that's part of having a healthy ecosystem environment as part of a city. Right. So what this has led us to do is it led us to begin to rethink about how we think about the environment. And I think this is a useful way of beginning to think about how we're thinking about our reactions and what's going to play out after our virus goes away. So historically, we've thought about it this way. Is if you think of 3 Venn diagram circles, right? We've got the environment. That's the overarching one. That's the big one. Everything sits in the environment, and we just utilize the resources within the environment to support society. And then in turn, society supports the economy. Okay? So think of this as a fairly hierarchical relationship. Okay? Now, this has since shifted. Okay? And so part of it began to come out of that Chicago heat wave, and I think we might see some things begin to come out of this virus. Okay? And so again, this was first put forth in 2006. So now it's been around for a while, and it's now mostly become the predominant way on how we begin to think about health in cities, sustainability of cities, development in cities, being able to see these things as not hierarchical, but much more blended together. And so as opposed to seeing the environment as something that we sit in and we leverage its resources from, it becomes something that is inseparable from social fabric, from the economic fabric of a city, tied to the environment. And so depending on how well you as a city manager or as a city population manage the intersection of these 3 big ideas impacts on what kind of city you have. So you might have a city that has a decent social fabric, and it's also leveraging the environment in meaningful ways and not trying to grab as many resources to support economic development, right? You have a city you can probably live in, right? It's a bearable city. Whereas if you have a society or a city that really focuses on social fabric while also trying to support economic development, particularly for all of its citizens, you might get a more equitable city. So it might be a fair city. Okay? But it might not be a sustainable city because you're not really thinking about how you integrate the environment as much into those 2 things. So then if you're balancing environment and economic, you probably are viable. And this is probably mostly where we have been at as a society for the most part. But if you can leverage all 3 and bring all 3 ideas to bear, that's when we begin to have a sustainable model for a city. And that's what we're going to kind of explore and how this impacts health-related issues, both in terms of critters, animals, as well as people. So, one of the things that we do know is that we are social, and we are now deeply connected, right? And we probably will be more after this environment via technology-wise. And so Peter Warden, who is a social statistician, did a little analysis on where people are connected to with their friends on Facebook. And so he went through and he looked at pages that set up where you can become a fan of the page or you like the page, and where those people were from, and then did they interact with each other. And so it did turn out that there were definite structures. And so one of the things that he called the Northeast and kind of the upper Midwest was stay-at-homia, because these folks tended not to be as interaction with the rest of the country. Dixie, which is just represented by the South, tended to be interaction, but notice Atlanta is kind of a hub, right? Atlanta is busy connecting the Boston, New York area, and it's connecting to Chicago. You can see those nice maps and lines. Texas tended to be its own little bubble. Then we had California down here. That also tended to be a little isolated, but connected to the major cities. Then you had a little area where Utah is located, and then you kind of had the West, which there wasn't as much interactions going on just because of the populations, but you can see where their connections began to fold out, particularly with Denver and Phoenix here. So this kind of gives you a sense that you begin to even develop tribes embedded within a social network system. But embedded within this are cities, and the cities that have evolved in these different areas are very different. As you'll see when you go look at the Putting Greater Cool website, you'll see up here that these cities versus these cities down here are much more sprawling than these cities up here. These cities down here in the Southwest tend to be actually a little more densely populated than the cities here. The cities here on the kind of in the stay-at-homea land tend to be cities that have a bit more of a focus on tech and biotech and things like that. Then, of course, you've got the San Francisco and the Seattle area. Okay? But you're starting to see that emerge within Texas, and you're going to see how that impacts the development of different cities.